Don Quixote on Wall Street, or 20 Years of Wilmot and Pierre Menard. So like Don Quixote, I've been attacking windmills for the past 20 years, writing about the metaphysics of finance in Wilmot. But today, on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the magazine, I thought it might be a better idea to talk to you of something different, to talk to you about Pierre Menard. So while the truth is that I've been writing in Wilmot for 20 years, the secret that I'm going to reveal today is that behind the scenes, I've been reading over and over again Pierre Menard for 20 years. And this reading is really what inspired the writing. And over the years, it turned out to be much more difficult than the writing. So my hope today is to use perhaps my conclusions in the metaphysics of finance to try to shed light on Pierre Menard and help me and help us understand better Pierre Menard. So who is Pierre Menard, or rather, what is Pierre Menard? Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote, is the full title of a short novel by Argentinian writer Georges Borges that he wrote in 1939. The main character, Pierre Menard, is an early 20th century French writer living in Nîmes in south of France. And so, as the story goes, Pierre Menard has just died, and the narrator, who happens to be a close friend of Pierre Menard, discloses to us through correspondence with Pierre Menard that Pierre Menard, in the last years of his existence, undertook the incredible task of writing Cervantes's Don Quixote, word by word, as an original writer, not as a copier. This, of course, is fantastic, because you wonder how could anyone write an existing text without copying it. And in order to understand how that's possible, we will have to change completely our way of thinking about time, about probability, about the whole logic of original and copy, and about the nature of temporal processes and writing. But to give you from already a flavor of the relation of this with finance, it has always struck me that Pierre Menard is a kind of Black-Scholes-Merton option trader, because despite performing the perfect replication of a past text, the Don Quixote, his writing is not redundant. As a matter of fact, if you read through Borges' novel, you come to believe that Pierre Menard has managed to create something new and original, and something that was unheard of. And this, of course, makes me think of the option trader who, although he performs perfect replication of the option, manages to bring something new and actually quite revolutionary, which is the options market. So my two fundamental equations for today are, first, it is as difficult to understand what Pierre Menard really did as it is to understand or derive the future from the past, obviously because he has written a past text and yet he has brought something new. Or more specifically, it is as difficult to understand what Pierre Menard really did as it is to understand how a backward-looking derivative valuation model can become a forward-looking derivative pricing function in the so-called market models, where, of course, you will see that while I contrast backward and forward, I will be opposing valuation to pricing and opposing model to function. And the reason why I keep saying what Pierre Menard really did is that even though Menard's task is from the outset quite incredible, and Borges's fiction is, of course, impossible, when you read it, it does sound very real. And I, for one, have always thought that it was pointing to a different reality than the one we know, a reality perhaps without possibility or beyond possibility and probability as we know them. So our purpose is to try to explore this new reality today. Of course, the future is difficult, and there is no better place to express how difficult the future is than in finance. The future is the most difficult thing in finance. And enough to cite Emmanuel Derman, who, of course, is a prominent quant and writer in the field of finance. In a forthcoming publication, he says, a difficulty common to every financial model is that one can get statistics only from looking back. We cannot know the future expected returns, standard deviations, and correlations of the stocks we can invest in. So because we don't know the future, obviously, if we have a financial model on our hands like Black-Scholes and we want to connect it to the future and connect it to what we expect from it to achieve in the future, we can only connect it through complex propositions such as the one I continue citing Derman. He says, if you know the future volatility of the stock, and if that volatility prevails, you will be able to replicate the option by dynamically trading a portfolio consisting of some shares of stock and a riskless bond. If you know, if that future volatility prevails, you will be able, these expressions, to my eyes, introduce alien time registers and therefore logics. They are incomprehensible conditions or utterances from the point of view of the timeless formalism, because the formalism just says, let volatility be sigma. So you wonder, what does the clause, if you know, or the clause, if that future volatility prevails, mean? I mean, volatility is supposed to prevail anyway, independently of time and in knowledge, because the formalism posits to be sigma. So to my mind, this points to a scandal, not of finance, but of philosophy of finance, or of the way we want to interpret the financial models. Because financial models, as we have seen, are at a loss to grasp or express the future, when, as a matter of fact, they are supposed to deal with the future and nothing else than the future or less than the future. So this makes me wonder, when will the time at last come when the future becomes the common natural language of all financial models and not the common difficulty, and the past and the whole notion of historical data or statistics becomes themselves unutterable and unthinkable? So I'm looking forward to an inversion of the logic and inversion of the language like the one in Pierre Menard. And I think that we have started to set foot on the path leading to such an inversion. And I cite as witness, and I noticed that historical volatility and implied volatility are beginning to get separated in two totally different and perhaps incompatible registers. And I cite as witness this recent and, to my mind, very important paper by Damiano Brigo, where he exhibits two statistically indistinguishable dynamics, i.e. dynamics where if you computed the historical volatility statistically, you would get the same number, yet those dynamics yield totally different option prices and totally different implied volatilities. And it's, of course, in the dimension of the forward-looking implied volatility that we want to establish ourselves. Of course, what Derman has said is not new. I mean, it's quite paradigmatic and uncontroversial. And the reason I've mentioned him, of course, beside the venerable reference, is that it has recently struck me that Menard is the anagram of Derman. And this I found was very fitting for the present talk, because it makes me wonder, can the future be the anagram of the past? Can we express the future by twisting the past like Pierre Menard did in a way? So what I will do to try to explore this possibility is now give you a list of quotations, literal quotations from the short novel Pierre Menard to put you in the mindset and the mood of the short novel, followed by quotations from the market models. So the first sentence of the novel is the following. The visible oeuvre left by this novelist, Pierre Menard, can be easily and briefly enumerated. Unpardonable, therefore, are the omissions and additions perpetrated by Madame Henri Bachelier in a deceitful catalogue. So Bachelier got it all wrong from the beginning. We all know that he looked at the stock exchange as a place where the downward and upward movements of the stock averaged out, and therefore he computed options values as expected mathematical expectations, and he totally missed the argument of replication from Black-Scholes in exactly the same way that Madame Henri Bachelier has missed the replication of Pierre Menard, as is indicated by the narrator of the novel when he says, second, I shall turn now to the other work of Pierre Menard, the one that Madame Bachelier has missed, the subterranean, the interminably heroic production, the œuvre non pareille. This work, perhaps the most significant writing of our time, consists of the 9th and 38th chapters of part 1 of Don Quixote and a fragment of chapter 22. And Pierre Menard, the narrator continues, did not want to compose another Quixote, which surely is easy enough. He wanted to compose the Quixote. Of course, anyone can compose a remake or another Quixote. As a matter of fact, Cervantes himself has composed another Quixote because he composed something that turned out to be the Quixote later. it's totally different and completely more difficult to want to compose the Quixote in advance, like Pierre Menard wanted to do. Later, I will speak of writing the future, and it's the same. The future also is easy. Anything, the future can turn out to be anything. It's enough to wait and see. It's totally different and completely difficult to want to write the future. Pierre Menard's goal was never a mechanical transcription of the original. He had no intention of copying it, of course, and he certainly did not want to compose one of those parasitic books that set Christ on a boulevard, Hamlet on la Cannebière, or Don Quixote on Wall Street, so books that take vulgar pleasure in just, shuffling the contests. On the contrary, his admirable ambition was to produce a number of pages which coincided word for word and line for line with those of Miguel de Cervantes. And here it's very clear that the words of Pierre Menard are not copies of the words of Cervantes, because there is effort going on here to bring them to coincide with those of Miguel de Cervantes. There is a process going on. And of course, the difficulty of understanding this process is our topic today. Menard, towards the end, confides in a letter to the narrator by saying, "My purpose is merely astonishing. The final term of a theological or metaphysical proof is no more final, no more uncommon than my revealed novel. The sole difference is that philosophers publish pleasant volumes containing the intermediary stages of their work, while I am resolved to suppress those stages of my own." And as a matter of fact, the narrator tells us that there is not a single draft that Menard has left us to bear witness to that years-long labor. So even if Menard did not leave us to consider but the final text, which was the replica of the Quixote, he does insist on the process of the proof, even though he has suppressed all the intermediate stages and burned them, actually. And he finally said, Menard, "The task I have undertaken is not in essence difficult. If I could just be immortal, I could do it." So this makes us wonder, what is this essence that Menard needs to reach in order that his task may no longer be difficult? We are, of course, tempted to think that it is time, because he speaks of immortality, but we later see that time is not the matter here. Now quotations from the market models. And in this, I will refer to these two works. First, Stochastic Volatility Modeling, which is the book by Lorenzo Bergomi in 2016. And second, a three-part article that I have written myself in Wilmot recently, which comments on Lorenzo's book and interprets the market models. So the fundamental principle of the market models is that vanilla options have always traded. The genesis of their market is immemorial. So it's the same situation as in Pierre Menard, where we want to use the models to price options, but we consider that the options market exists already. That's why they are called market models, in the same way that Menard is writing an existing text. Options have always been hedged with options, and not only with the underlying, as the fundamental theory wants us to believe, and more specifically, exotics are hedged with vanillas. This means that the vanilla options are on an equal footing with the underlying asset, because they will serve as additional hedging instruments like the underlying asset. Their market prices or their implied volatilities become independent state variables that we need to model directly. And if we strictly speaking, then, and for the logic, this means that the vanillas are no longer, strictly speaking, derivative on the underlying asset. As a consequence, we have a pricing function. We can no longer look inside the depth beneath the surface of the market. So all we have is a pricing function that reflects the surface of the market, because market models, as I said, do not rely on an underlying stochastic structure or the stochastic process for the underlying asset price. They do not look inside the depth under the surface, but they only look at the surface. They look at the existing options market instead. Formally, they are represented by a pricing function, which, for instance, will yield the price of the exotic, a function P of time, of the stock price, and of size, where size are the implied volatilities of the additional hedging instruments. In the general case, these will be vanilla options or forward variance contracts. But continuing with the same logic, we can say that even though its price is underlain by the prices of the vanillas, the exotic option is not derivative on the vanillas either, because the whole logic of underlying and derivative has been abolished. The whole logic of valuation, as a matter of fact, is abolished. Instead of valuation, we speak of a pricing function, as I have said. In other words, astonishingly, the underlying process, the backward computation, the probability schema, the arbitrage constraints, which would make us implicitly, ultimately recover the vanilla prices as expectations. In other words, all the apparatus of thought that we are accustomed to put ourselves in whenever we consider valuation are only in the end numerical procedures or artistic renderings or interpretations. They are no longer fundamental. Instead, the pricing function is a present and automatic response. And the thinking here is to say that the forces of the present market are such that given the vanilla prices, or given the market, because this is what represents the market, the pricing function tells us this is simply automatically the price of the exotic. Henri Labordère, for one, speaks of automatic option pricing. I can refer you to his paper. So it's automatic because we no longer go to the maturity of the exotic option or of the trade and roll back, because we are and the whole logic of valuation, as I said, which is the backward-looking valuation, is abolished. And because we are in a market, immersed in a market anyway, and everything trade, what's the meaning of immaturity in the market? For all the vanillas and the exotics are all trading, so the only payoff, the final payoff that they have is only the next price that they will get in the market anyway. And in this sense, causality is inverted. The underliers, the ones that underlie the pricing function, could be anything whatsoever. They underlie the pricing function because they will keep underlying. So we say, as we see, we refer to the future. They no longer refer to a common past underlying cause. So they're no longer necessary derivative on the same underlying asset as the exotic. They could be anything whatsoever, different instruments, because this is the market's pricing function. So if the market wants it this way, who are we to argue with the market? And the causality is inverted because the market, as I've said, is postulated to exist already. The pricing function, as we've seen, yields a price and is underlain by prices. It's totally immersed in prices by both ends. And we speak of P to represent it and not of V as valuation, P for price. And you can notice, for instance, that the notation P instead of V is consistent throughout a book like Bergomi's. And because we assume that the market prices already exist, this means that the only working equations that we have are ex post accounting equations that we compose by computing P&Ls. So we have ex post accounting coming first, and only later, if we wish, a probabilistic interpretation of those ex post accounting equation. So we begin with the ex post accounting, and next, if we wish, we have the ex ante attitude, which is the attitude of expectation or the whole attitude of probability, by the way. And as I've said, the market is immemorial. It has already solved all the arbitrage problems. It is superior to probability and arbitrage. Why? Because it can integrate effects that we cannot model probabilistically, if only the effect of recalibration of the probabilistic model that we are using. The market exists, period. And this is why the pricing function of the market is extraordinary to my eye, and I will call it pricing writing function. You will see why. Because even though this pricing function is underlain by a stochastic model or a correlation structure in all practical instances, no such model is ever final. In essence, the pricing function keeps looking for the next generation derivative market. This is very important. This is actually the crucial argument here, because it's true that the pricing function has in any practical implementation to have a certain stochastic model. If you, for instance, you talk about the Black-Scholes pricing function, there is a volatility in it, and you want to make an assumption about that volatility number to put a number there. But ideally, because you will be hedging with vanilla options, ideally this number, this parameter, you will want to imply from the prices of the vanilla. So you are always looking to the market. And even later, when the pricing function becomes more complex and is underlain by the size, by multiple hedging instruments, of course, you will need to make an assumption about a certain covariance matrix that covers those size. But the pricing functions will always want to imply this covariance matrix from the prices of options of next generation. In that case, it will be options on variance or options on VIX. So this is why the pricing function is superior to probability and prevision, because probability and previsions are backward. Prediction is always a case where you project the future scenarios, so you freeze the future and you want to predict the future, therefore you want to look at it from behind, whereas the pricing function is forward, because it is always it is superior to prediction. It writes the market, it writes the future and doesn't predict the market. It is at one with the future event, because the market is always faster than prediction, always faster than probability model, and the pricing function, as we said, has the same speed as the market. The pricing function is really ultimately a function only with underlying variables and no parameters. Why? Because any parameters that you give it in any projection that you want to have practically, those parameters ultimately you want to get from the prices of options of next generation, so those parameters will become prices, therefore will become potentially underlying variables of the pricing function and not parameters anymore. So this function is quite extraordinary. It has only underlying variables and no parameters, so it cannot be written. Only when you project it into a practical implementation can you write that model or that implementation. But the pricing function, in essence, cannot be written. You can think of it, if you want, as a kind of deep learning device. It's so deeply linked to the market that you cannot observe the specific model that can represent it. There is no model that you can observe, because it deeply learns from the market. Only it learns from the future, not from the past, obviously. And this is why we can speak for it literally of a memory of the future. And to illustrate all of this, I propose this opposition between the tip of writing and the probability pit. You will understand later why I use the term probability pit. And this diagram I also borrow from Derman, by the way. But obviously here, the probability representation is the one, let me show you, on the left here, where you align the future scenario at maturity. In this case, these are the prices, for instance, of the underlying asset. And you roll back in your tree to value. This is the valuation model. You roll back in your valuation tree to compute the value of an option, say. But no sooner have you done this than the value of the option becomes a price. So the market always overtakes the probabilistic model and the valuation model and the tree. So the vanilla value becomes a price, and in turn, the prices of these vanillas, because they are trading, will have to be written in another tree, and you will enhance your tree, and you want to have a stochastic volatility model. But in turn, the values that you will get in that enhanced tree will always become a price, and they will invert. That's why you compute implied volatility, because the market always goes faster than the probability, the backward-looking probability, and that's why the diagram or the tree inverts. And this is how the pit of probability gets inverted in a tip of writing, and this is why I talk about writing. Let's keep that diagram in mind, because this is what will later illuminate better what Pierre Menard is really doing. So finally, now to try to draw the two strands together, the one by Pierre Menard and the one from the market models, and try to look what's beyond probability and beyond the past. But before that, I need to look what's beneath probability, and to look into another novel by Borges. And the novel title is Funès, His Memory, a novel that he wrote in 1942. Its main character here is a young man, Ireneo Funès, who lives in Uruguay. He had an accident one day, and when he woke up, he was inflicted with infinite memory. He just remembers everything. His memory is the infinite concatenation of particulars. He himself says of himself, at some point, I myself alone have more memories than all mankind since the world began. My memory is like a garbage heap. And the narrator tells us that Funès remembered not only every leaf of every tree in every patch of forest, but every time he had perceived or imagined that leaf. It, for instance, irritated him that the dog of 3:14 in the afternoon, seen in profile, should be indicated by the same noun as the dog of 3:15 seen frontally. So according to the narrator, Funès was simply incapable of general Platonic ideas. He was incapable of abstraction. He could not abstract the dog. And we could simply say that Funès simply does not think. And we can talk about him of a memory pit, because at some point he did reflect and he did think to classify his memory in a mental catalog that he would have to memorize too, of course, but he very quickly realized that by the time he died, he would still not have finished classifying all the memories of his childhood. So instead of thinking and advancing, what he did is he sank and regressed even worse, deeper into his memory until he could no longer breathe. And as a matter of fact, he died at the age of 19 of pulmonary congestion. But what I think personally is that his main illness was that he never wrote. He did not write. He did not exchange. He never got outside his memory pit by writing. His future, because Menard will write, you should see the difference. His future was all eaten up by his past. He had no project. And to my mind, if I want to draw here a probability analogy, Funes's memory corresponds to the sample space, capital omega, that we use in probability theory, but only that space without abstraction, without a point of view or event space that cuts into it. Because as you will see, the sample space also will be a kind of probability pit. And to my mind, Funes' memory is the concrete situation in its infinite and absolute concreteness. And let me tell you why. As we all know, probability theory is the theory of the concrete world. So, for instance, when we throw a dice, the random variable is X here is the number that we will throw on the dice. And all we are interested in is the number that will come up. But because there is a concrete situation, you know that the random variable is always triggered by the random sample omega here, which refers to the concrete world. But as we said, we are only interested in the numbers that come up or combinations of that number. We don't care to inspect the concrete situation in its detail. We don't care whether the dice we are throwing are blue or red, or whether the player is smiling or is unhappy, or whether it is sunny or it's raining. We don't care of all those details, but someone like Funes would care. As a matter of fact, he cannot help it. Those details get inscribed into his memory against his will. But the reason why in probability theory we keep the reference to the sample space is that if the time comes and we inspect the concrete situation closer, and for instance, we find that the table on which we are casting the dice is randomly oscillating, the same way that we would find that, for instance, volatility is no longer constant, but is stochastic, or if we found at some point that the gravity on Earth is oscillating, or even if we found that the world is going to end at some point randomly, what we have to do in order to introduce this in our volatility, in our probability model, and is add new sources of randomness. We have to recalibrate the probability model, even up to the end of the word itself if we want, and this can always be accomplished by digging one level deeper in the bottomless memory of the concrete sample omega and in the sample space. This is why we keep it. Only when we do that, this is what creates the backward narrative. For instance, gravity disappears on Earth, and we go in sample space and we do the backward narrative by saying it has always been the case in the sample space, and we reboot the backward narrative this way. And this is actually an act of violence that we commit against thought, because we reboot and we say that from the start, the sample has always been one where gravity would eventually disappear. So this is, to me, is the explanation of the backward narrative. But this is different from the situation in the market in which the whole sequence of recalibrations have already spontaneously happened, as I showed you. So this is why it's a memory pit. You always have to dig deeper. This is the representation of probability. So Funes is under probability. He doesn't reach the level of probability space because an ordinary man will think, but Menard does. Funes does not think because he's immersed in the probability pit. But we wonder, does Menard think? So Menard's process is that not only does he think, actually he thinks all the time. Often he has been misinterpreted as being a kind of, statistical monkey that types on his machine with infinite life, immortal life, and ultimately with probability 1, he will end up, typing the Don Quixote as any other text. But this is not true because Menard, as we know, does not write at random. He thinks of all the drafts that he has composed in the meantime. So Menard, if Funes was under the probability space, Menard is not equal to the probability space, it exceeds the probability space. Why? Because the writing function of Menard cannot be identified with any of the intermediary steps that he has got, the drafts, or any of the stochastic models. Why? Because the intermediary text that we would consider would fall into probability space. We would measure its distance to the Quixote. We would fall again into the backward schema where the future is crystallized and recognized, and into evaluation. We would evaluate the intermediary draft that Menard has produced, and we would recognize the state we're in. We would recognize that it is different from the Quixote. So if it's different from the Quixote and we are able to compare it with the Quixote, what is it doing here? Because we might as well have the Quixote already. So there's no way this evaluation algorithm can be applied in the case of Menard. His writing function is the same as the pricing function of the market, and that's why, by the way, we are told in the story that the intermediary stages have disappeared. Menard has burned them all because they cannot exist. I mean, his writing function cannot admit of them as an underlying, the same way as the pricing function can no longer have an underlying stochastic structure. And not only does Menard think all the time, he thinks all thoughts, because towards the end of the novel, he says to the narrator that he, Menard, believes that every man should be capable of all ideas, and he believes that in the future he shall be. So this is pointing to the future, not to the past. And having all thoughts is very different from memorizing all the details like finesse. Pierre Menard says, thinking, meditating, imagining are the normal respiration of the intelligence. And I comment that having all thoughts is more than a concatenation, because you can have the thought of the thought leading to total consciousness if you push that process to the limit. So perhaps Menard was a creature with total consciousness, and that's how he managed to write the Quixote. Menard is free to choose to be Cervantes or Menard, if you read the story, not a slave of his memory like Funès. He may not have a project of his own either, but he has a purpose, an astonishing purpose. Menard seeks neither the concrete detail like Funès, nor the variety of thought. He seeks the essence. My task is not in essence difficult, mean that it will become easy when he reaches the essence. And immortality is not to be understood in time, is to be understood as a creature, immortal creature, which has all thoughts. And what makes Menard's task even more essential is that he didn't, in the end, want to add another thought to the existing collection of human thoughts. Ultimately, he's recognized all intellectual exercises are pointless, so he resolved to anticipate the vanity that awaits all the labors of mankind and to undertake the complex task of writing an existing text. And this, to my mind, is a form of ultimate freedom. So what Menard does more than thinking is that he writes. Menard actually makes the tip of writing the sharpest possible, to my mind. Why? Because if he were writing a new text, like an ordinary writer, the tip of writing would be diverted by the novelty of the text, where it's here, it's completely concentrated on the existing text. Menard doesn't carry the memory of the Quixote because he writes faster than any algorithm that would recognize and memorize the Quixote. He carries the memory of its future, writing it without an underlying, as I've said. Also, it writes continually, and Menard has produced endless drafts and never conceives or recognizes or evaluates, although it exchanges continually. Menard's writing function cannot be written any more than the market's model pricing function. Menard writes faster than thought. And if we listen to Maurice Blanchot, who is a very famous French literary critic, he says, in a literary work, one can express thoughts as difficult and of as abstract a form as in a philosophical essay, but only on the condition that they are not yet thoughts. So perhaps we should not yet think what Menard has really done, but embrace writing instead. Thank you.